Now I'll finish up with two more relatively minor points. The first one being Ben Shapiro's point about U.S. involvement in private industry. So, as an example, President Trump has gotten the U.S. government involved in a share of certain corporations in 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 a quid pro quo kind of situation where we'll give you these we'll streamline the regulations process or whatever it might be. I believe Intel is one of these companies. Um, the oil companies might be another example, maybe considering Venezuela, right? Um, we will streamline this process for a share of your company. Now, it's a minority share, so the government isn't actually running these companies. They're only gaining a certain amount off of the profit of these companies, which on its face looks like a great idea because now the government has an outside source of revenue other than just taxation. And this is related to, say, tariffs, where tariffs are independent of the taxation policy. Of course, they have a marginal impact on the price of goods. And I say marginal because clearly it is marginal, uh, because prices continue to decline when compared to the inflation rate, um, broadly speaking. But as a general matter, you get into some hairy situations when it comes to the government influence on corporations. And I think this is a great example of an area where President Trump clearly shows he's not a standard conservative. That conservatives generally do not want the government involved in business, whether it's a minority share or a majority share. When you get to the point of having a majority share and running the company, making the decisions for the corporation, then that starts to look a little bit like communism, actually. Uh, or not necessarily communism, because the political side of that may not be there. Mercantilism or um, something of that nature, as far as an economic system is concerned. I believe there are examples. I think South Korea may have been one of these cases where this was the modus operandi for the government corporation relationship for a long period of time. And the problem with that, besides the philosophical reality, the philosophical approach to this argument, is that government doesn't necessarily have the expertise or the know how to run a company, to run a corporation, to run its business. The people that know the business are the business owners themselves. The people that know how to run the business and make the decisions that make that business profitable are the ones that put their lives into it, right? Rather than bureaucrats. So it is best to avoid things like this. And this is one of the examples of something that the Trump administration is doing that is probably not a great idea for precedent's sake, for the sake of we don't want this kind of practice to continue consistently over time because you set a precedent, you set a standard, and someone else takes the same action, citing this as precedent, citing this as, this has been done before, and they're not necessarily as business minded as Trump, okay? Because let's be honest here, President Trump was a successful businessman before he became president. So he might have good business sense to be doing these things, but is it the role of the federal government to be doing these things? Is it a good idea in the future for a president that might be just a lawyer or a doctor or a career politician who has no real knowledge about business? And it's not even to say that Trump is running these businesses himself. He's certainly not. And of course, again, minority share, he's not really running the business anyway. But it's a precedent we want to avoid. And I think it's something that the Trump administration needs to scale back on, needs to, not do. Okay. And the deals that they have made should be formatted so that they, run out in a certain time frame. Because, again, the federal government shouldn't be involved in doing things like this. Now, Newsom really doesn't say anything about this particular issue, as far as I remember from the interview. It was largely a point that Ben Shapiro made, and I agree with that point. I think it again is a bad idea in general for the government to be involved directly in a private, a publicly traded perhaps, but private corporation. We have some cases where this generally isn't true. Utilities are public-private partnerships to a certain extent, and some of us have had issues with the utilities companies and their effectiveness and rate setting and all of that. And you can clearly see that the government role in these companies may be a problem in and of itself, but the very nature of the business and the public nature of some of these resources complicates that concern. In general, that isn't the case with, say, Intel. Manufacturing computer chips should have no aspect of government intervention beyond government contracts for certain products that they need for, like, the defense industry. And so I'm not going to beat that point with like a dead horse, but so my last point is that is one of foreign policy. And if Gavin Newsom is going to run for president, we have to take a look at what his approach to foreign policy is going to be. And frankly, we have no clue. We have no clue. I'll suggest that in this statement he made, he was lying because I looked into this. He says that he had no problem saying that the Iran nuclear facility strike was unbelievably effective and the right thing to do. He suggested that he made a statement at the time to this effect. I went back and looked, and maybe there's a statement out there. It's not on his social media. It's not in an official document or official statement, but he said absolutely nothing to the effect that he supported the strike on Iranian nuclear facilities in June. I believe I miscited the time frame of the 12-day war in a previous podcast, saying it was July. I'm not sure why I get those 2 months confused. But when I say the July war, I'm actually referring just to the 12-day war, which was in June. And I'm still very confused as to how I'm getting that wrong, but let this be my correction. In any case, Newsom's foreign policy approach is completely unknown. We don't know. All I can tell you is that when it comes to foreign policy as it relates to things that are closest to our homeland, immigration, immigration enforcement, uh, things of that nature, obviously he's going to be very lax. You're not going to see any ICE enforcement. You're going to see a lax border again because the border wall. I don't know if the border wall is being built. Doesn't seem like it is. I don't know what's going on there, but the border is now far more secure than it's ever been, thanks to President Trump. And you can guarantee that the Democrat will not continue that. Absolutely will not continue that. It's one of their bugaboos, and it's absurd, but it's the truth. Um, and in a later podcast, I'm going to talk about the new Virginia governor and how she turned on a dime, uh, went from being a moderate to being a radical Democrat again. But that's for another podcast. As far as foreign policy, it is probably something that the American people do not look at as much as they do other issues. And that's part of why this part is so short. But it is something to consider, and something I personally consider a problem for me because the front runner for the Republican nomination is obviously JD Vance. Whether he actually is the Republican nominee for president in 2028 or it's someone else remains to be seen, but he is the front runner. And one of my biggest issues with him is foreign policy. I believe that, I mean, it's very clear he's more isolationist. He doesn't really want to have an aggressive foreign policy that puts that President Trump has showed he's very well, comfortable doing, pushing our interests abroad, uh, and for good reason, but also avoiding those entanglements that everyone has started, has come around and started, you know, complaining about Iraq and Afghanistan for, for better or for worse, for intellectual honesty's sake or not. You know, there's very few people out there that are going to say, like I do, that the Iraq war was justified and the Afghanistan war was justified, and the biggest problem was that we didn't stay long enough. Very few people are actually going to say that. Actually, I'll amend that. It's not that we didn't stay long enough. It's our politicians, Barack Obama, rejiggered the mission such that we were less effective and in our mission, and then handed it over at a time when, at least in Afghanistan, clearly the government wasn't going to be able to maintain control, and in Iraq, uh, a significant terror threat existed. We had to go back in, but now it's a little bit more stable, and it looks like it will remain so. The Iranian influence notwithstanding. Uh, in any case, I digress, of course. But we don't know what Gavin Newsom's policy on foreign affairs is going to be, except to say that he's going to be very lax on immigration and immigration enforcement. And that alone is a serious problem. And I think, personally, I can live more with a JD Vance isolationist policy that is strong on the borders than a Gavin Newsom weak on the borders policy, with the unknowing of whatever he'll do in terms of uh, diplomacy, whether he's going to be an effective president in that regard. And saying Gavin Newsom and president gives me the heebie jeebies. Uh, but in any case, it is something to consider. I appreciate anyone who has listened to these podcasts. Obviously, I said I was going to split these up and also have one large one put together to put on my show. Um, Again, like, comment, and subscribe. I really appreciate it, and if you do so, and hopefully, again, hopefully this expands its reach. I know some of these are long, but I hope they're substantive enough that people actually are interested in listening. Maybe it opens your mind a little bit. Maybe you think twice about something. Maybe you agree with me. Maybe you disagree with me. That's the point of these. Okay, so I appreciate you, and have a good night, everyone.